do a quick introduction. I'll ask Greg, as one of the founders of BX48, to do a quick introduction. And then I'll hand it off to Garland for a quick tutorial over here.
Sure.
And sort of what we're doing today. We're going to have some fun. We're going to play around. Welcome to the Bronx. I know some of you guys are coming in from Long Island, Staten Island, lots of islands. Welcome to the mainland. Does your footing feel a little bit differently here? A little bit? Awesome. So we're going to give the AC about 30 seconds longer. There it is, and it's done.
Awesome.
So my name is Carlos BIDO. I am the owner of 10 by 10 Studios. I'm a photographer and filmmaker. This is my space here. We're doing this lighting workshop as part of a prize as a community sponsor with BX48, which is a 48-hour film festival that's for the Bronx, people of the Bronx, and the outer boroughs as well, which I thought was a really cool initiative to get people to create films, to create work, and they just ranged. Everyone that participated this second annual event ranged from first-time filmmakers to filmmakers with other experiences. And when Greg and the rest of the team reached out to me and say, hey, do you want to be a community sponsor? I said, absolutely. Like, please sign me up. What can we do? And when we thought about how I could help besides sort of support and advice or anything like that, I said, how about we do a lighting workshop? Because a lot of people just, don't have a chance to be in a proper studio to work with proper equipment. And there's no such thing as proper or the right kind of equipment. Actually, our workshop today is going to use some practical bulbs over here. So this is sort of where we are. The second prize cinematography or first prize cinematography team is here today. The Golden Cut.
Yeah.
Golden Cut, new friends, production company out in Staten Island. Did a pretty dope film. I recognize your face, not just from the eyes. You were the doctor, the scientist person there. Welcome, guys. Welcome, welcome. And yeah, this is exciting. Hopefully this becomes a thing where we just sort of come into the studio and we put together some workshops. We play either with my equipment or we can bring in, some rentals just to play with. I love the space. I sort of built and designed it myself. And it's not just for me to do my productions, but it's also for the community. That's why I have it open for rentals and that sort of thing, and workshops like this. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Greg to do a quick intro.
Got it? Yep, so my name is Greg Hernandez. I'm one of the co-founders of Bronx Film 48. And in designing the second annual Bronx 48-Hour Film Challenge, we wanted some prizes to incentivize people from the outer boroughs to compete. And one of the cool things was to partner with local businesses and initiatives, specifically ones that could provide a workshop space and equipment for filmmakers to really advance their skills. And what better community partner than a Bronx native who is a business owner and has their own space and a lot of equipment. So really, lighting being one of the keys with cinematography. This is the lighting workshop for the Golden Cut because they won the cinematography prize. And it was something that we wanted to do something dope. So this is something that we're live streaming so that others can learn as well. We're not a nonprofit. We are a community filmmaking initiative in the Bronx. That's a phone ping. And yeah. And this is what we wanted to do, something fun. So yeah, here we are. Thank you so much for joining us. And I just want to really give a big shout out to Carlos BIDO, the founder and owner of 10 by 10 Studios. It's located in the South Bronx. So if you need to rent a dope space in the South Bronx for your projects, music videos, photography, commercials, anything, it is a beautiful space. I highly recommend it. Carlos is amazing to work with. And once again, he is a Bronx native. So support your local businesses. This is fantastic. It's 10 by 10 Studios. You're seeing it live streamed on Facebook. And please check out their website. Please talk to Carlos. Rates are flexible. He's amazing. Definitely check it out. Thank you.
Awesome. Cool. So I'm going to go man the live switching, and I'll leave it up to Garland Berenzy.
Sure. Alrighty, thank you so much for coming, guys. Really, really happy to be here with everybody. By a show of hands, who here has lit something before? Anything? Awesome, excellent. And another show of hands, who here feels confident that if somebody showed you an image, you could light something based on that image? Maybe? Okay. And who here feels confident that if someone described to you how you wanted it to look, you could light something based on that, based on just a description from somebody? Okay, cool. Well, all of those things are things that we do in lighting, right? We have people that come to us and describe how they want it to look, or they show us a reference image of how they want it to look, and we do it based on that. Or we do it based on collaboration of something new and organic, but usually there's some sort of core inspiration that happens there. So generally, the difference between your average, say, YouTube video that you see online and a movie that you go and see in the theater isn't so much going to be the difference in the camera or the lenses, although of course that will play a role, and having higher end equipment definitely helps. But one of the main critical things that makes imagery achieve a certain level of production value, so to speak, is going to be the lighting that you have and your understanding of that lighting. So by utilizing some really basic concepts and understanding the way that light actually behaves, we can light scenes with very little, just very, very simple tools, things that are inexpensive and very accessible to everybody. So with that, we'll get into the basics of how light behaves. And we'll start with the size of our light source. So when you imagine being outside and you have sunlight coming down on you, what would be some qualities of the shadows that are produced? What would those shadows kind of look like?
Hard shadows.
Hard shadows,
Yeah.
right? So they have like very defined lines. They're probably darker and have like very even, as we would call it, umbra. There's umbra and penumbra. So the darker part of the shadow would be the umbra, and the lighter part of the shadow would be the penumbra. And that may be graduating from the darker part of the shadow to the lighter part of the shadow. But when you have that sunlight, it's mostly just umbra. It's those hard defined shadows, as opposed to what we have here, which are softer shadows. And the reason for that is because of the size of the source. The sun is actually a very small source. Even though we think of the sun as gigantic, right? It's so far away from us that in the sky, it's just a little, it's like a little circle, right? Whereas if you have an overcast day, the size of the source becomes massive, right? And then the shadows start to disappear. So one of the most important aspects in lighting is considering how large should my source be? If we're doing a beauty commercial, say for a makeup brand, or lighting some sort of talent that needs to look beautified, so to speak, we're probably going to be using really big sources, really small sources to eliminate a lot of those shadows, especially shadows underneath the eyes, shadows underneath the chin, perhaps, so that we're really illuminating the skin, we're illuminating the eyes, and we're bringing out whatever that natural beauty is. Whereas if you're doing a narrative project and you want it to be scary or spooky, you might use a really small point source, so that it's a harder light, as we mentioned with the sun, so that you're getting those deep shadows and you're getting that higher contrast. So one of the things I wanted to play around with today was actually looking at examples of these sources. So Carlos, if we could kill the lights on the cyc.
By the way, we weren't live yet. Oh, we'll do intros again later. We're live now, yeah. Oh, yeah. Hi,
Hello, everyone. So, is everyone familiar with this clamp light source? Very, very accessible. You can get it at Home Depot for like $6. So, very, very achievable form of light. And you can clamp it to whatever. So, with this, we have a much smaller source. We have harder shadows here. If I sit here, actually, you know what? Let me reposition this to the other side. I'm going to come from camera left. If I sit here, which you probably notice, if I pull my mask down for a second, is that I have harder shadows on this side of my face. My nose shadow is probably sweeping across my face. The source is almost 3/4 in front of me. That would be a pretty standard position to come from when you're lighting a face. But of course, these are all creative choices. And this is a harder source. It's a smaller source. Now, does anyone have an idea of how we might be able to easily make this source bigger? Sure.
Putting some diffusion in front of it?
We could totally put some diffusion in front of it. Then the diffusion becomes the new source, and it's much larger. Anyone have any other ideas as to how we might make this source bigger or softer? Well, one of the things that we could, did you?
I was going to say maybe more separation between the light source and the subject.
Well, putting the source farther away, if you think about it, would actually make the source smaller, right? If I bring this in, it'll be larger compared to my face. So almost, but that is a good point that we're going to get to in terms of distance of the source from the subject. That will definitely affect the quality of light. One of the simplest things that we can do to change the size of our source would just be to bounce it into a large source like this. So if I sit here now, probably notice that a lot of those shadows have softened up and have changed. And that's one of the easiest, quickest ways, quick and dirty, so to speak, that we can make a source softer. If anyone here has heard of a book light is a source that's bounced and then has a layer of diffusion in front of it. So the bounce is creating a larger source, and then the diffusion is creating an even larger source. So the light is getting very, very soft. So if you think of diffusion as diffusing the light and making it softer, that's correct. But really the effect that's happening is the source is becoming bigger. Does that make sense to everybody? Does anyone have any questions about size of source?
Does it change if you put the light closer to the bounce or farther away from the bounce? Like where your light's distance is from where you're bouncing it?
It would change in terms of the intensity. And depending on how large your bounce is, it could affect the size of the bounce. If you back it away, the spread will fill more of the bounce, and therefore the source will be bigger. But if it's a small bounce and a small source, it may not matter as much. Yeah. Anybody else have any questions about it? Alrighty. So with that being said, that's the size of the source. One of the bigger principles. Now, has anyone here heard of inverse square law before?
I did in college, but I completely forgot.
So the inverse square law is kind of getting into what you were saying in terms of distance of the source from the subject. And this is one of the most critical forms of, or one of the most critical aspects of lighting that we have in terms of knowing what our exposure is very intuitively without having to meter everything. But in this case, we will meter so everybody can get an idea. I'm going to strike this ellipsoidal source here. Okay. And we'll save this. So essentially, what the inverse square law states is that every time you double the distance from the source, you cut your exposure in half. So inverse square law naturally is logarithmic, if anyone remembers logarithms. I had to relearn it myself when I was doing all this. But so if we have an exposure, just for example, of f8 at 5 feet, then at 10 feet, we'll have an exposure of f5.6, if anyone here is familiar with f-stops. And f-stops are also logarithmic, because if light moves logarithmically, then naturally the way that we measure light has to be logarithmic as well. So if you go from an f2 to an f2.8, that would be a one-stop gap. If you go from a 2.8 to a 4, that would also be a one-stop gap. But what's really happening is when you go from a 2 to a 2.8, you are doubling the amount of light. If you go from a 2.8 to a 4, you're doubling the amount of light again, and so on and so forth as you go through that scale. So what we'll do here is we'll take a measurement. Would anyone like to take this reading?
Sure.
Yeah, you'll do it, Jason?
I mean, I've never used it before. So
yeah.
I was
It's-
I think you're better off using it.
It's
Or
super simple.
I'll use it, yeah, sure.
I'll show you.
Give it a shot, yeah.
Alrighty, so we're going to use the incident meter, which is right here.
Okay.
And to take the reading, you're going to use this trigger right here on the left. We can rotate it, and you'll hold it right here. And then I'm just going to need you to hold a hand outside of the beam here so I can measure the distance from the
Okay.
light. So
Gotcha.
I'll be right back.
Think about that philosophically.
As you're saying from like,
Yeah, so right there. So I'm going to measure it from the end of the source here. And then come a little bit closer, about a foot closer to me. Keep coming. Right there.
okay.
So right there, that's 5 feet. Go ahead and take a reading.
Oh yeah, wrong button. There you go. Got it. Okay.
And what does it say?
3, 2. F 1.8.
It's actually an F32.
Oh, F32. Gotcha.
Right, so there's a really, really bright source, right?
Gotcha.
So it's giving us a lot of output. If we were to change the settings, the camera settings that are in the meter, it would give us a different reading
ISO is
depending.
800. Right?
Yeah, ISO is 800. If we set the ISO to 400 instead of a 32, do you know what it would give us instead?
Okay, 32 would be 16.
Yeah,
Alright, cool.
16, exactly. Does that make sense to everybody?
Because we just did like divide by 2.
Right.
So, yeah.
No, I'm so sorry. Not 16, 22.
22.
But very, very close. Yeah.
Okay.
16's two stop, right?
Yes, that would be 2 stops.
Gotcha, okay.
Right. So, okay, so now you're at the 5-foot mark. We're going to
Yeah.
take you to the 10-foot mark.
Okay.
So just take a step back till we hit about 5 feet roughly,
Cool.
and I'll let you know.
5. Right here.
Almost. Need
Don't want
2
to
more
chip on
feet.
it.
Here, let's clear that out for you.
Thank you. Keep grip.
I'm just doing my job.
Yeah, that's about 10 there roughly.
Okay.
So go ahead, take your reading.
Okay. F16.
F16.
Yep.
Here, can I do this for a
Yep.
second? Okay. And so there's another reading here, FC. those are foot candles. So the only difference between foot candles and f-stops is that foot candles don't require camera settings to take a measurement of light. They're standardized. So a foot candle is just a foot candle. Here, I can pan this out of your eyes for you. It would be the same for any measurement of light, whether it's lux or foot candles or f-stops. So when you took the first reading, it was 1,000. And then when you took the second reading, it was around 500 foot candles. So we're doing the same thing. As we double the distance, we're halving the exposure. And so that's just inverse square law that allows us to have an idea of where the positioning of our light or how the positioning of our light is going to affect our exposure. And that goes for the same for a dimmer, for example. So if you come here and you take a reading where you are, I'll pan it back in for you. Do we still have our reading of a 16?
No, we're at 11 right now.
We're at an 11?
Yeah.
Okay. So if I take this dimmer and I bring it from 100% down to 50%, what do you get now?
F8?
F8, which would be one stop, which is half the amount of light, right? If we came down to 25%, anybody have a guess as to what the meter will tell us?
5.6.
5, 6.5 or something? Look at half of 50. Yeah, 5, 6.
5, 6.
There you go. And that's inverse square law. So it is really a general purpose, very broad concept of lighting here. So you start to understand the way that light is behaving. So the next example would be a bounce source. So we have this little handheld mirror here, which we'll set up. So if you could put your hand right next to the mirror, we'll measure our distance from the source. So that's about 9 feet 9 inches. Can you move it about a foot closer to me?
Okay.
Okay, and then I'll take another reading. Okay, a little closer. There we go, that's about 8 feet right there. So if I take this light meter and I give it to you to take a reading right in front of the mirror.
Over here?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And let us know what that gives us.
5.6.
5.6,
Yep.
okay. And so I'll take it now. And so that mirror is 8 feet away, right? And so obviously I'm 8 feet from the mirror as well, so that's 16 feet total, right? If he got a 5.6 over there, does anyone have any guesses as to what I would be getting over here?
3.5.
Almost, very close.
4.
4.
Yeah.
It would be one stop less than a 5.6, which would be a 4. And if I take a reading right here, I'm getting just under a 4. It's a 2.8 and 7/10. So very, very close. So what we start to notice is that as we double the distance, the length of the exposure is also going to grow. So the consistency, I should say, of the exposure is also going to grow. So say we have a really, really bright source, such as an 18K, 18,000 watts, and it's up in a crane really, really far away from set. As you come down to set, the exposure is going to be more consistent, more even. So it actually helps us a lot to have sources farther away because we get a nice, even blanket of light, right? Whereas creatively, if you want something more sourcey, say you have a light bulb hanging right above somebody's head, that's going to have a very quick fall off. The top of that person's head is going to be really bright, and it's going to quickly not get quite as bright. Whereas if you took that light bulb and you made it really, really bright, maybe twice or 3 or 4 times as bright as it was before, and then moved it farther away, the top of their head would be much closer to the exposure of the bottom of their head. Does that make sense to everybody, this concept of inverse square law? Does anybody have any questions about inverse square law? Cool. All righty. So we have the size of our source, and we have the inverse square law, these core lighting principles that kind of help us understand how light moves and how it behaves. The next one that I'm going to show you is angle of incidence. Oh, here, yeah, I can grab that from you. So is anyone here already familiar with angle of incidence, roughly, and what it is? Well, actually, everybody here is intuitively aware of angle of incidence. We just don't realize it. So when I take this mirror, if I pan this source over, if I pan this mirror to the right, where's the light going to go? To the right, right? If I turn this to the left, where's the light going to go? To the left. It's pretty intuitive, right? It makes sense. And as you can see, obviously that works in nature. The reason this works is because of this simple principle of the angle of incidence. And that is, I think the best example of this is to take 2 volunteers, maybe 2 that we haven't had up here yet. All righty. I'm going to bounce this over here. Okay, so if I have someone stand over here and someone stand over here, can you guys take a step away from each other? Great. Now, both of you look into this mirror here. I'll tilt up and make sure. Are you guys able to see each other?
Not right now.
Okay.
I see him now.
Now you see each other?
Yes, now that he shifted.
If you notice, the mirror is in the center of you guys, and you guys are both at equal and opposite angles. If both of you, if you take a step to your left and you take a step to your right, you'll still be able to see each other, right? And that goes for if you go all the way, say, over here and over here. Now, if one of you becomes a subject and one of you becomes a light source, we're really just utilizing the angle of incidence. And the reason you're able to see each other in the mirror is because the mirror is highly reflective, right? It has high reflectivity, we would say. But we have all sorts of surfaces that will bounce light in different ways. This wall also follows the angle of incidence. If I were to bounce light at this angle, the optimal amount of light coming off of the wall would be equal and opposite to the light coming in. It's just more of a diffuse reflection, we would call, which we'll get into in a little bit. So the angle of incidence equals the angle of reflectance. If you have a source coming in at 45 degrees, then that source will be bouncing off at 45 degrees. How much of the source bounces off depends on the reflectivity of the object that you're bouncing off. So this principle is really, really helpful for us. If you have, say, a stray reflection, or you have a glare in the lens and you can't quite figure it out, all you have to do is think about the angle of incidence. Well, okay, it's coming from over here, so all I have to do is take that angle and find the opposite angle of it. Okay, it's going to be something over there, for example, right? And this is also really helpful for optimizing our bounce. Say you have like a 4x4 B board, like a little just bounce card, white bounce card. and you want to optimize it on your subject's face, you can do that by seeing where your source is and setting up your bounce to be exactly split between your subject and your source. It's all very intuitive, but when you really think about it, it solidifies it in your head so that you can use this purposefully when you're lighting and intentionally when you're lighting. And that's angle of incidence. So when you step to your right, take 1 or 2 steps to your right, are you still able to see him? No. So if you take 2 steps back, now you're able to see him again. What you're experiencing is what we would call the family of angles. The light that you're seeing that reflects him is within a certain family of angles. And so that's going to be your optimal bounce trajectory, so to speak. Does angle of incidence make sense to everybody? Does anyone have any questions about it? It's pretty simple, right?
Yeah.
But it can be so essential to the way that we light. Alrighty, and so the next, let's see here. The next core aspect of lighting for us is going to be the types of reflection and reflectivity. So as we saw with our mirror, you guys are welcome to have a seat now, thank you. As we saw with our mirror, oops, sorry, hope I didn't blind anyone there. The exposure between the direct source and the bounce source is very, very close. It's because this mirror has a really high reflectivity. Probably fairly close to 100% of the source is being bounced or returned back at exactly the angle of incidence, right? Now, say that instead of this mirror, we had this piece of paper. It's still being bounced. You can still see my hand cutting that light, but it's much more diffused. It's much more diffuse. This would be a diffuse reflection, and this would be a direct reflection. They are 2 out of the 3 types of reflections that we have. And those are the ones that you're going to encounter most often. The third, we won't get so much into today. That's polarized direct reflections. It's where only part of the light is going to be reflected. If you're interested in that concept, you can absolutely check it out. You can Google types of reflections and you can read into it. But for our main purposes today, diffuse reflections and direct reflections, and everything in between those two are going to be our main focus here. So what's happening when we have a direct reflection? Well, these photons, I mean, light is really just photons moving through space, that's what it is, are coming directly at this mirror and then bouncing at exactly the same angle. If we bounce, but we don't have a source, or a surface with high reflectivity, then instead of that light being bounced in exactly the same direction, it's going to bounce all over because the surface is uneven. The surface isn't as reflective. So if you have a mirror, or if you have soft silver, which is pretty close to a mirror but not quite as reflective, then you start to get into this area where it's like, okay, well, it's not exactly as diffuse as the sheet of paper, for example, but it's not as direct as the mirror. So it's good to have in your arsenal some different types of materials that you can use to reflect and bounce depending on what type of reflection that you want. This might be way too strong. You know, you can see it on my hand very, very clearly. My hand is very flat, as we would say. One side of my hand is getting hit with a lot of light. The other side of my hand is getting hit with a lot of light. It may not be what you want, but maybe that sheet of paper, that diffuse reflection, isn't enough. So that's when we start to say, okay, well, this is actually what I need. I need some soft silver, something kind of in between. I want it to be a harder light, but not quite as hard. Do the types of reflections make sense to everybody? Pretty intuitive, right? It's not too difficult to wrap our heads around. Yeah.
So before you were saying umbra and then penumbra, right?
Mm-hmm.
The shadows.
Sure.
So, like the one on the far right would be like umbra, and then the like softer shadow on the left side would be penumbra, or.
Well, to get into that, this right here, that would be umbra, right? Here, this, that's the penumbra, right? So we have this sort of gradation from the darkest part of the shadow to the lighter parts of the shadow, and then to, of course, no shadow. Of course. And if we were to diffuse this source, rather than having this deep dark shadow here, the shadow would spread and be more of penumbra. So you can start to design how you actually want your shadows to look, which is really, really important in terms of achieving a certain look that's desirable, especially when you get into commercial lighting and the clients are very specific about what they're looking for, right? They have an image in their head that they're imagining. Our job is to take that image and make it a reality, right? And these principles help us do that. Cool. All righty, guys. So that's the essential kind of core stuff. There's a lot of other aspects to lighting that you can learn about. As I was kind of passing around, there's this really, really great book here that I highly recommend for anyone that is interested in learning about how light behaves and how light works. It's called Light Science and Magic. It's a textbook, so it's a little bit on the pricier side. It's around $50, but totally worth it if you're somebody that wants to learn about lighting. And that's not so much the technical of, this light does that and that light does this. It's more of like the scientific creative, so to speak, how light moves and the physics of lighting and things like that. So with that being said, we can start to get into like more of the creative stuff. And the first thing would be, does anyone know what I mean when I say key light? Yeah?
Yeah. Oh, like a key light, like what you're, like.
Sure. Well, what would be your idea of a key light? When I say key light, like, what do you think of?
I think of like the main light that's hitting the source of your scene.
Primary source, yeah.
Primary source. Absolutely. And I'm so happy that you said that, because a lot of people, when they think of the key light, they think of the brightest light in the environment, right? And that's not necessarily always the case. Usually, your key light will be your brightest source, generally speaking, but a lot of times it's not necessarily true. And you might have a light in the background that's lighting trees or something that might be brighter for a particular reason. That's really helpful. But starting with our key light is our main light that's going to be lighting our subject, whether that subject is me or this mirror or a bottle or a hair product or whatever it is. Our key light is going to be that source. And so let's set up a key light here. Oh, sorry guys, not to blind everybody. All right. Yeah, actually that would be great. This is true. Textbooks do get pretty expensive, don't they? Alrighty. So for this, I'm going to pan this upward so I'm not blinding everybody here. Carlos, would you like to come be our subject?
I would love to, but I am live mixing over here.
Gotcha. Is there anyone that would like to volunteer to be our subject here?
She's like the learner. I think Emily should be like the subject.
Whoever is willing to do it. I'm going to grab this chair here. You want to come sit for us? All right, so here I've set up a basic key, right? If everybody's looking at it from I guess sort of more this perspective here, you can start to kind of see it.
Whoa, I thought we were supposed to move over here to look at it. That's what I did.
Yeah, no, you got it. That's definitely the idea. So right now, this key is filling in the right side of her face, her right side, camera left side, right? And our key side is going to be divided by the center of her face when lighting a human subject, right? The other side is going to be our fill side. It's the supplementary lighting that would be lighting the portions of the subject that the key isn't lighting. And that could be active or that could be passive, meaning this source here is a passive source. It's light that's being bounced passively, so to speak, to light her. If I were to take this light and place it over here and shine it directly at her, or even directly at her through diffusion, that would be an active source. If I brought in some bounce over here and I bounced the key, that would be passive fill as well. Now, she's probably not getting as much light as she could be. Does anyone, based on what we just talked about, have an idea as to why? Yeah.
Square law?
Inverse square law could be one, absolutely, because we could move the light in a little bit closer, right, and she would be getting more. Does anyone have any other suggestions as to how we might optimize the light that's hitting her?
Do we want more intensity on her, or we want it to be softer? Sorry, what was the question?
We essentially want to use this light source more efficiently. So right now the light is bouncing, but she's probably not getting as much of it as she could be. Yeah.
And then we could raise up this sheet and then move the light over behind it and then shoot through the sheet to her.
Absolutely, we could come direct. That's another option. We could also, we could bring the bounce in a little bit closer too. Another very simple thing we could do is if we think about the angle of incidence, a majority of the source that's bouncing off of this sheet is going to end up over here. If we think about how this angle is exactly opposite and it's going to end up over here. So if we actually backed our source up a little bit and had our light over here, she would be getting a lot more of that source because of the angle of incidence. Does that make sense?
Cool. Yeah,
so let's take a look and let's see what this looks like through the sheet. I'm going to swap out with you so that you can see what this looks like as well. So we have this sort of very soft source, right? The shadows are very light and diffuse, so to speak. Sometimes the shadows may not even be present depending on how soft the source is. You know, if you have an overcast day, as we mentioned before, on an overcast day, there may not be any shadows at all. And so that's a whole wide range from hard shadows all the way to shadowless. That would be a spectrum of hard to soft light. And hard and soft light is really how much the light is wrapping around you, coming back to the size of the source. Compared to me and my face, this source is relatively large. If I were to back this light up, the source is even larger, right? And so now, theoretically, even if it doesn't seem that much softer, it is softer, right? And if we had an even bigger bounce and we spread it out for the bounce even more, that light would wrap, so to speak, around my face. So wrap is an important thing to think about when considering your source.
Can we see what the light looks like when we do the incident, the light on the other side?
Yeah, absolutely. Here, do you guys want me to sit and you guys can jump in and move this source?
I'll get the cable. You just pick the light up.
There you go.
Yeah.
So before you move that light, I would just tilt it up, just so that you're not blinding everybody when you're, Yeah. Nice. Great. That's perfect. Alrighty.
Ready to go? Yeah. 5 points.
Cool. And then, nice.
Okay. So over here.
So that you're probably going to want to go to the right of camera. Or sorry, your right of camera. Camera left. Yeah. Great. Okay. So now we're going to need to optimize the bounce. With where the light is positioned right now, it's going to be slicing the bounce a little, right? So we're going to want to pan the bounce away or push it closer to the wall there. Great.
Okay. Watch out, guys. Lowering.
So obviously with the mirror, the difference is very, very dramatic. All the light is over here. With such a soft bounce, it's a little bit harder to tell because you're really illuminating this, and because it's a diffuse reflection, the light is being spread everywhere, right? If you look at the floor, you can see it's not just coming in the angle of incidence, it's spreading out almost a little bit more evenly. But because we have the light set in a way where we're optimizing that reflectivity, we are getting more over here than we would be, say, over there.
For sure.
Yeah.
It does look more even on you, I think.
Yeah.
I think so.
Excellent. Great. So now I would love to jump into key positions. So I'm going to come a little bit closer to the camera, and I'm going to rotate my chair like 45, 30 degrees or so, right? And so if you notice, if I pull my mask down, the side of my face that is facing camera would be the near side. It's the side of my face that's closest to camera. So right now, we're illuminating that side of my face. That would be called a near side key. This would be a near side key. If I come over here, and I plug this guy in real quick, even though the color temperature is very different, okay.
On track.
Edgy.
Does anyone, just out of curiosity, does anyone know what we would call it, and it was out of curiosity, when we would mix a daylight source and a tungsten source?
Split lighted?
Almost. It's a food term. Call it salt and pepper. Yeah. Just curious to see if that got salt and pepper, yeah. So now if you save that source, if you just hit the off button real quick. All right, I placed it pretty roughly, but this would be a far side key. This is lighting the far side of my face. Lots of people love to light far side because it illuminates. Carlos is raising his hand right now. We love to light far side because it highlights our subjects in a really, really interesting way. And it gives their face a lot of shape. If you notice, when we were lighting near side, it's much flatter. It's not quite as defined. If you have someone with a sharp jawline, if you have somebody with really defined facial features, a great way to do that is with a far side key. It's really popular for narrative. It's really popular for commercial music videos. It's something that can be applied in any walk of film. And this could be with an actual artificial light source, or it could be a natural light source. If this represents the sun, if you are shooting me like this, it's going to be a near side key. But you can make a creative decision. Say if you're shooting a documentary or something like that, oh, let's just spin you this way. That way the sun is hitting you from 3/4 behind. Does everyone know what I mean when I say 3/4 behind me? Does that make sense?
Positioning of the light.
Yeah, if you imagine a big circle behind me, you know, behind me would be 0, and here would be 4. It's like 3/4 behind. It's just how we would define an angle. So that's near side and far side. Near side and far side obviously doesn't really apply when I'm looking straight at camera because the camera splits my face 50-50. It's not like there's a far side and a near side. Does anyone have any questions about near side and far side key? Really, really excellent creative choices that are available to you there. Welcome to play with it as you wish. Now, that was a far side key. What would be the difference if I placed this light a little further behind me? Gives me a little bit more of a silhouette, right? It's highlighting me a little bit, so to speak. So the difference between this setup and where we just had it, even though it's a very small adjustment, is this is actually no longer really a far side key. It's maybe far side key-esque, but really it's more of an edge light. It's more of a backlight. And that comes into the next part of the different types of sources that we have. We had our key light, right, which can come from behind or it can come from in front. It can come from the top or the bottom. Key light can come from wherever. It's the main source of light. Then we have our fill, which is going to be the supplementary. And now we have our backlight. And the purpose behind a backlight could be many different things. It could be to highlight the hair in a subject. If you're doing a hair commercial and you want that hair to like really pop, it could separate your subject from the background. Say, for example, if I was in front of a black background and had a black shirt on, I might disappear into that black depending on our exposure, right? If we're at a very low exposure, I might just look like a head floating in a void space, which is maybe what you want. If it's not what you want, which generally it's not, you might add a backlight, which is going to add a little rim of light over the shoulders, depending on where you position it. It's really anywhere from behind the subject that's hitting them. The difference with this being our far side key and this being our backlight might not even be this angle. If we have a really strong key light coming from this source, this would no longer be a far side key, right? Because our key light is now in front. This now becomes more of a back edge, but it's a back edge that we would say is wrapping around the front a little bit more. Our back edge could also be this. This is still a back edge for me, but it's not direct. So it's a less effective edge, so to speak. You don't really get that rim because it's not hard light coming at me, but it is edging me for sure. And if you strike that ellipsoidal unit there, now we have our key source, and I have like a little bit of this edge coming in. But the thing is if you dial that up all the way to 100%, we're going to start washing out our backlight a little bit. It's not quite as defined of a source. So we start to think about directionality. Are our sources blending together? Is that something that we want? Sometimes we want to shape these sources so that they're not intruding on each other, which is why a lot of backlights will be direct instead of bounced, because the bounce light is going to fall off very quickly, so to speak. So if you have a bounce source coming from behind and it's pretty far away, you're going to need a pretty powerful source in order for that backlight to effectively reach that person. But what happens is, as we can see with this, because this is spreading, primarily it's going to be bouncing over here because of our angle of incidence, but it is spreading all around this space, so it's not very well controlled, right? Would be another reason to use a direct backlight source, because instead of this bounce here is spreading all over the floor, it's going to be kicking up into me and lighting other areas that I don't necessarily want to light. I really just wanted that hair light. So that ellipsoidal source you can see here has these hard edges. It's got a series of lenses that allow us to focus it very specifically like that. If I make adjustments to the source, I can defocus it and make it a little softer. I have these leaves, and I can cut it, and I can make it different shapes and sizes.
Well, it's like built-in flex.
Exactly. It's like built-in flex. So a unit of that type, which as I said would be called ellipsoidal because of that lens element. A LICO is an ellipsoidal source. If you've ever heard of BIDO lights, these little tiny 150 watt lights, they have a lens adapter that can make it ellipsoidal. And this lens adapter is also an ellipsoidal lens adapter, right? So that would be a really great type of source to use as a backlight because you could really focus it in on that person's head so you're not spilling light all over the place and you have a little bit more control in your scene, so to speak. And in lighting, we love having more control because we're not depending on the sun. You know, in a studio it's very nice because you set it up in the beginning of the day and you don't have to really worry about the position of the sun changing. You don't have to worry about clouds coming in and totally changing your exposure and your quality and all these different things. But as with this shoot I was on yesterday, it was supposed to be a bright, sunny day, and we got totally rained out, So it's a little difficult when you're shooting on location when you don't have that control, because the client wants something, your job is to deliver that something, and if you have elements that you can't control, it makes your job just a little bit harder. So that would be our backlight, our key light, our fill. There's some other types of sources here. So let me get a way to implement this. Dial that down to 25% for me. I'm going to start with this off. And if I sit here, I just have my key light, right? Our key light is also spilling onto the back of our cyc. If I wave my arms up and down, it's creating shadows on our cyc. In order for our cyc to not have those shadows, the light source illuminating the cyc is going to have to be brighter than our key. It's a perfect example where the key is not the brightest source, right? But the cyc light is not illuminating me, right? So it's not our key. It's not illuminating our subject. So one of the things here, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. Where were we going with this? We were
different types of light.
Different types of
Different sources.
Right. Thank you. Of course. So here we only have this single source that's illuminating me. In a lot of environments, the key might be right, the fill might be right. You might not need your edge, or maybe you have your edge and it looks good, but it still looks a little dark. It's not quite high key, as you might say in commercial lighting. High key meaning very bright, it pops. If you see like a Neutrogena commercial or something, or Pantene or something like that, it's very, very bright. They're all on this white cyc, and they look very illuminated. That might not necessarily be because of a really bright key or an active bright fill. It might be because they have really well-controlled ambience. And so ambience would be the fourth thing that we go into here. An example of ambience would be if you take that light and you just kick it up into the ceiling right there. So right now, since this is our only light source, and this is the light source that is lighting me, this is kind of our key. But if we have a key light coming in over here, and I'll just supplementary come in with this real quick. Now, once again, this is salt and pepper, so it's not exactly the way we would do it. Either that would be tungsten or this would be daylight, usually. But now, I have to dial that down probably another 15 points. Yeah. Now, OK, cool, great. Now we have a key over here and we have our ambience being controlled by a simple bounce into the ceiling. So if you off that, you'll notice there's not a huge change, but it's noticeable. It's certainly noticeable, right? The overall light in the environment has kind of changed a little bit. And so ambience can be really, really important in terms of establishing things like time of day. You know, if it's a bright morning and the sun is beaming through the window, that sun is going to be kicking off of the floor and kicking off of the walls into the ceiling and creating ambience. If all of those walls and the ceiling and the floor are painted black, there's not going to be a lot of ambience, right? Because none of that light is really going to reflect. In this space, it reflects a lot because we have the white ceiling, we have the white walls, so our ambience kicks around quite a bit. And so this could be really, really good in terms of if it feels too bright, but you're not quite sure why, because your key is set, it looks good, your fill is set, all of your other sources look pretty good, but it just feels too bright or it just feels too dark. You might want to cut down your ambience or fill in your ambience a little bit more. A kick into the ceiling is a really, really easy way to add ambience. Is anyone here familiar with the term negative fill? Yeah? Who's the grumpiest person on set? Negative fill? So negative fill would be the opposite of passive fill. Instead of adding a bounce like this, we would just add a black rag, a solid rag, we would say, or a flag that would subtract light. Rather than adding light, we are adding a source that is blocking light and removing light from that side of the face, right? And the closer that negative fill is, the more effective it's going to be. Whereas if you move it really far back, but then make the negative fill larger, also more effective when it's larger, right? So if anyone here knows Shane Hurlbert, he's a really big fan of building 12-foot by 12-foot negative fills and then bringing them in, because negative fill, just like the way light will wrap, negative fill will wrap a little too the larger it is. Because if you think about it, if my negative fill is this big, this isn't negative and this isn't negative. But if my negative fill is this big, now the fill, or lack thereof, is extending much farther and therefore able to reach around the face or around the back of the head, something like that. Yeah, absolutely. If we could get a V-flat in here, that would be great. Thank you, sir. Okay. I'm going to give this to somebody. Anybody that wants to audition this? Yeah. Excellent. So we'll start with it out. So rotate it so that the edge is facing me rather than the face, if that makes sense. Yeah. Keep going a little bit more. Keep going. Cool. So now it's off, so to speak, right? The negative fill isn't facing me. But if you pan it in towards me, yeah, keep going. And then walk it in a little bit more. And then come back this way. Yeah, keep coming. And then walk it in towards me even more, about another foot or so. You'll start to see that all of the kick, and here I can hold it so you can take a look. All of the kick off of the wall over there is now being blocked by this V-flat. But also the V-flat itself is not allowing a lot of light to be reflected off of our key. And if I bring it in really, really close, of course it's more effective. If I bring it in a little farther away, it's less effective. But also, coming back to the idea of reflectivity, this is a hard source, or it's a hard surface, so to speak. You'll notice that these solids look much darker than this looks, or for instance, the fabric chair there, that's because they're soft, they're absorbing more light, so to speak. If we come over here, and I'll just spread this for a second. Here, everybody come over here for 1 sec. Take a piece of this in your hand. You're gonna notice that there's a soft side and a side that's like not quite as soft. The soft side is always going to be facing towards set because it's going to be absorbing more of that light. It's not going to allow it to reflect as much of that light. So even though this is black, it still can allow light to bounce off of it. For instance, a great example would be this black chair. Even though the chair is black, I can still, let's see if I can line it up. I can still get a ping off of it with a hard enough source. Maybe this isn't quite hard enough because this is so reflective and shiny. If I face the chair towards you, you can probably see a reflection of the light in the chair. This would be an example of a polarized direct reflection. It's not quite like a mirror, but you can still see the hard shapes. So the light is still being directly reflected. It's just not 100% of the light is being directly reflected. So that would be our negative fill side of things. And so the reason I bring up negative fill, with your ambience, you can add a light source, kick it into the ceiling, that'll add to your ambience. Or you could add negative fill above, and that would remove ambience. If you wanted me to be in a black void right now, sure, you would probably paint the site black or add in a bunch more of these solids, but you would want to make sure that the top is also very dark so that that source is in a dark void and it's not bouncing and creating more unwanted ambience off of the rest of the room. So it all comes back to this idea of control. And so that's ambience. Does anyone have any questions about ambience? No? All pretty straightforward. The last source of light that I wanted to talk about would be specials. Specials are pretty intuitive, I would say, in terms of the way that they're named, because a lot of the things in lighting that we name don't really make any sense. But a special would be like, if I'm sitting in this chair, and if you strike that light and pan it back into our bounce over here. Specials. Yeah. And then we can dim that up to 75%. Great, thank you. So now I have my key, right? It's kind of kicking off and giving me a little bit of an edge. This is also giving me a little bit of an edge. But really, this is pointed at this stool, for example, here, right? This would be a special for the stool. I'm the subject, but there's other things in the frame that I want to highlight. Specials are used often in architectural lighting. So one of the things that I love to do when I'm doing architecture, like, for example, I did a Bud Light commercial, and the scene was in a bar. I taped a white fabric sheet of muslin to the ceiling, and I kicked a LECO, an ellipsoidal light, into it so I could control it to only bouncing on that muslin. That became our ambience. I added in our key, but then we had all these bottles behind the bar. So we added in these little BIDO lights to just ping off of these little bottles. The bar also had these big columns, and we added lights shooting up the column. So you really start to see the inverse square law in effect. The bottom of the column was really bright, and it gradually got darker as it went up. So it added really nice gradation and highlighted the space. So those would be specials that were added in. Little lights that we placed everywhere to kind of illuminate the architecture in a different way than what you would usually see. And specials really helped with establishing a better ambience or ambiance, if you're talking about it in like an architectural sense, I suppose. So specials are really great if you have something that you want to illuminate that's not your subject that you think is going to add to your scene. That could be something in commercials. That could be something in narrative. You know, it could be a subconscious thing in narrative. You know, sometimes you'll be watching a movie, you'll watch the movie through, and you want to watch it again because you loved it. And the second time you watch it through, you notice something that you didn't notice before. You're like, oh, that receipt that's in, you know, 5 scenes from now, we see in this scene. I didn't see it before, but I see it now. You might notice that that receipt has a special light on it because that's a narrative element that they want to put in the scene. They want to illuminate it, but they don't want it to be, you know, dramatically illuminated. That's where you start to find the balance. You know, it's like, okay, we don't want it to pop. We don't want it to be like in your face, but we also want it to be visible. You know, we don't want it to not be noticed either, so to speak. So that would be specials. Does anyone have any questions about specials? Anyone have any questions about the differences in sources that we talked about, or the concepts of lighting that we talked about, and the way that light behaves? Does anyone have any questions at all?
Is like putting a light as a practical in the background considered a special? Like I put like a quasar to like, I don't know, make it look like some tube lighting or something.
Well,
Special?
it could be considered. It could be considered a special if it's illuminating a prop
Yeah, okay.
or something in the frame.
Yeah, the idea to take away is that it's like illuminating some object.
Right.
That's not the main
Yeah.
concentration.
Exactly.
Well, it could be, but like not like the subject.
And generally, specials, at least in my understanding, if you ask different gaffers, they might say different things, or even different cinematographers. A lot of us have varying opinions, you'll find, because there's not so much standardization as you would think, but there is at the same time. It's a gray zone. But with that being said, I would consider anything that's within the frame to be a practical, not to be a special, even if that practical is illuminating something. But it's kind of a gray line. You could call it a special. Let's add a special in here. You know, like I said, with like coming back to that example of the Bud Light commercial, those light sources that were illuminating the bottles and the columns and things like that, those you couldn't see the source. It was just light playing on the columns. It was just light playing on the bottles. If you see a lot of modern music videos, everybody loves having tubes in the frame.
Yeah.
Super, super popular way to light right now. Those would be practicals, right?
Understood.
Yeah, if you're like making a shape with the tubes or whatever.
Yeah,
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah, great question.
Thanks.
Any other questions that anybody has?
So like, what is it? Like, let's say like Indiana Jones, for example, like Jones like going through a cave holding like a torch. Would the torch be like a key but also a special? Because like you're able to see like props and stuff like that as you're going about the cave?
The torch would absolutely be his key light, right? Because if you imagine the whole cave is dark, right?
Yeah.
That's the main source that's lighting him.
Yeah.
The torch would be a practical, not so much a special.
Gotcha, okay.
Because you would never have a special that's also a key light, right? The idea behind a special is that they're lighting other objects in the frame that aren't your main subject, or they're not your main source.
Okay.
Yeah, so usually specials are very small sources, generally speaking. They don't necessarily have to be, but they just end up being that because usually you only need a little tiny kick or something, you know, over here. Does that make sense when I say kick? Do you guys know what I mean by that?
Yeah.
You know, this is kicking off of the bounce, or it's kicking off of the ceiling. Makes sense, right? Does anyone have any questions about terminology and like the language that we use in lighting?
What do you use like for apple box positions? Do you do like 1, 2, 3, or do you
1, 2, 3 is
what?
1, 2, 3 is absolutely can be used. That was the first thing that I learned. So here, we'll grab an apple box really quick. Oh, we got these polecats here. So, yeah, so this would be 3. It would also be New York. New York has really tall buildings. This is the tallest position, right? Then you have this, which is 2. It's the second highest position. So it would be Chicago. Chicago is like, not quite as tall as New York, but you know, they still have tall buildings. And then this would be number 1, or LA. LA is like really flat, don't really have a lot of tall buildings, you know. So that's where like the cities come in. 1, 2, 3 also works. Yeah.
What other like fancy terms other than like salt and pepper do you have on your belt?
Oh, I mean, there's hundreds. I guess it depends on what we're talking about. Another fancy term.
Can I teach you a new term?
Sure.
It's called goofy.
Goofy.
So goofy is when you mess up the gaff tape. So I just goofied this. So like when you mess the gaff tape up and it gets all tangled, you goofied it.
You goofied it or you goofed it?
You could use either.
I say goof.
Goofed?
Yeah, goof. So which is the original?
There's the passive and active version of it.
Yeah. Because I skate goofy. I thought that's what you're talking about. Skating goofy. Well, thank you so much, guys. I hope you. Oh yeah.
Why is a clothespin called a C-47?
Okay, so this is it's kind of like folklore. So the validity of this, I'm not entirely sure. But the story that we've heard is that there was a production company that was like trying to cut corners on everything. And so when they went through their gear list and they saw clothespins and X amount of dollars in clothespins, they were like, why do you need this? We don't want to pay for this. So supposedly, the story that I know is that they renamed it C-47 so that these producers would have no idea what it is, and they just think it's some technical jargon that they need. And they're like, okay, fine, you know. Are clothespins really that expensive to where that story could be true? I don't know. On majors, if you guys are familiar with the tier system, I'm in the non-union world, right? So I'm at the bottom. And then you have tier 0, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and then majors. So that would be the structure, and it's based on budget. So if you're shooting a major, you have huge amounts of gear. Lots of times you have separate packages. You'll have the shooting package, and then you'll have the rigging package. So if they call me in to do a union job as a non-union member, it means that all of the union people are out on shoots and they have nobody to work these jobs. And that's when they start calling non-union people. And that's why I had the opportunity to do shoots like Orange and Power and these other things, which are cool because you learn a lot on those bigger shoots and because it's scaled up so much. But yeah, if you're working on rigging, then you come in before the shoot happens. You set up, either you run some power or something like that, or maybe you even set up some light sources if there's a lot of lights that need to happen, and then you leave. And then the shooters come in, they tweak, they do everything, but the majority of everything has been set up, or the tedious work has been done already. The shooters leave, the riggers come back, break everything down. Then that's how a lot of union shoots work, and the packages will be separate. The riggers will come up and they'll set up the rigging equipment, which will go back on the rigging truck. The shooters will come in, they'll use the shooting gear to do the tweaks and things like that. They'll pack all the shooting gear back into the truck, but they'll leave everything that was set up by the riggers. Does that make sense? Yeah. It costs a lot of money to do it that way. So, yeah. But we do have rigging crews in non-union worlds too, because non-union shoots can be very extensive as well, especially depending on the politics of the shoot. For instance, like I did a feature, and it was a Chinese feature. They came to the States to shoot, and they didn't want it to be union for some reason. This is also kind of like coming through the grapevine, so I don't really know the validity of it, but what I heard is that they paid the union some sum of money to not get involved with their shoot, which is a whole political side of the film world. But what ends up happening is you have a non-union shoot that has a massive budget. So I was the key grip on that, but I had 7 technicians working under me, right? So when I have that many people at my disposal, I don't have to be going through and doing a lot of stuff. I do get active, but most of the time I'll be at the monitor with the cinematographer and the gaffer, and I'll just be walking like, hey, I need you to do this, and da-da-da, and it's a little bit more of an orchestration at that level. Whereas during the pandemic, during the pandemic, it's been small crews. For instance, I did a commercial for the General, the General Insurance Company. I did that like like 4 or 5 weeks ago, and I needed 3 more people than I had, and it was just me and my best, and I really should have had 4 people in my department total. And so we were like really kind of struggling to make up for the lack of labor there. But of course, during the pandemic, they're trying to keep crews very small to keep things safe, because we're trying to establish new protocol in this new sort of world. So, yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah, I'm going to wrap it up there with the live broadcast. We can continue the conversations. Also, before Garland starts talking about the shoots, I've put him in because he's now giving grievances on some of his shoots. But for the broadcast part of it, I just wanted to thank you. I wanted to thank Bill, Bronx Film 48 for putting this together, and the Golden Cut. I know the people that are watching the broadcast, or the handful of them that did miss the first part of it, will cut the video and be able to rebroadcast it. And, you know, people can watch it from the very beginning because we were recording it. So for this portion, we're all going to hang out. We're going to play. We're going to turn on the AC so we can cool off a little bit. And that's why I'm cutting off the broadcast. And thanks so much, guys. Thank you, Garland, and thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Yeah, there you go.
Does anyone know what this is?
That one's a little slippy, actually. Yeah.
This is your
Wood glue. You need new wood glue on that.
This is what they would call a Russian doll apple box. It's a